Audio conversation with Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, recorded Thursday, June 6th, 2014. I am recording this introduction after editing the full interview. I need to say, this was a powerful show, and it did what a conversation rarely does. It went to the deepest places, and in such thoughtful and poetic ways. This talk with Sharon is exactly why I wanted to start this podcast up again. To have a dialogue about the elusive experiences that confront real people and how it impacts the way they proceed forward in their lives. We explored the emotions and seeking and challenges that come with these transformative events. Sharon has a PhD in philosophy and has written a bunch of books, and we talk about these in the show. Most of the focus is on her work in consciousness research, most specifically the study of death and synchronicity, and how these avenues of research can overlap and blend together. She also wrote a very touching personal memoir titled The Supreme Victory of the Heart. This is a wonderful interview, and it runs for almost 2 hours, and we cover so much. I am very proud of this episode, and I need to give a well-deserved thank you to Sharon for her role in this show. Please enjoy. Sharon, thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. It means a lot to me.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Mike, for inviting me back, really. I mean, we did an interview, almost 5 years ago? It's kind of hard to believe. But yeah, I'm really glad to get an invitation. I guess this is actually a different podcast than that. That was The Unseen, Whitley Strieber's Unknown Country, and so this is Hidden Experience. And Hidden Experiences actually had an old incarnation, and now it has a new incarnation that started back around 2009. Yeah.
And I'll also put a link into the show notes for the Whitley Strieber interview. I listened to that just a few days ago to prep for this interview, and I remember there was a point after, when I was editing, this is going back 5 years ago, I just remember like, oh my God, why don't I shut up? I just talked and talked and talked. I felt like I talked too much. And then I listened to it again, and it was really a good, genuine conversation.
It was. Yeah, I actually listened to it again too, and I think it stood the test of time really well. I'm still really happy with what we both said.
Great, yeah. And we can get into that a little bit in this show. But now, for this, let's start the formal interview here. You've written a bunch of books, and you wrote a big fat book, and that is The Source and Significance of Coincidence, and the subtitle is A Hard Look at the Astonishing Evidence. And then later you wrote a little book, and it's titled Beyond Death, The Best Evidence of the Survival of Human Consciousness. And there's other books in there too, but let's just focus on these for now. And so these books have two different topics, but I think they could correctly fall into the category of consciousness studies. Mm-hmm. And now the question is, how do these studies reflect back on you and who you are as an author and maybe as a seeker?
Well, I think that they're a pretty good reflection of my primary philosophical occupations, the things that have really been on my mind for decades at this point. I was thinking the other day about back when I was in middle school. I had a friend, a close friend that, when we would get together for sleepovers, I remember one sleepover, like we would have these really deep conversations. And there was this one night where I remember us talking about like the ultimate nature of the universe and different dimensions and how consciousness might fit into all of this. So it's something that really has been part of my life for forever, since even before I knew what philosophy was as a discipline. I mean, I didn't discover that until college, really. So these books are rooted in that, foundational desire to understand what the universe is and what our place in it is. And they're also both shaped by experiences that I've had. Most of those have been a little bit more recent, not until I was 29, 30 years old. And I started having these possibly paranormal experiences and wanting to understand what was going on there. Because I had had a much more naturalistic understanding of the world, not physicalist, because I had a healthy respect for consciousness and thought that, it couldn't be explained simply as physical things, but naturalistic in the sense that everything is explainable in terms of just, the natural laws. Everything is law-based. It's pretty, if not deterministic, there's not a place really for the idea of purpose or meaning in the universe. But when I started having those odd experiences, that foundational idea I had about how the universe works also began to shift, and I began to try to figure out, well, what maybe consciousness is doing something more. It's not just that, we're aware of what's happening to us and around us, but somehow we're playing some much more integral role in the way that the universe evolves and develops and the kinds of things that happen here and what they mean.
You said you had these odd experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of experiences were those?
Well, when they first started, and actually, I've had trouble figuring out exactly when they first started, because I originally would date them to a really sort of traumatic period in my life that happened on the heels of a romantic breakup when I was 29. But as I've thought about it more in the years since, I realized that there were actually some other things that had happened in previous years, but I didn't have a place for them in my worldview. And so there was just kind of like, oh, well, that funny thing happened. And then you forget about it and you go on with your life. But later, once I had a framework for them, then I started remembering these things. I was like, oh, they kind of fit into this pattern. But in any case, so there had been this smattering of little things earlier in my life. But then in the wake of this romantic breakup, I was really very distraught and in a very difficult place. And some synchronistic things started happening to me. So it wasn't anything blatantly paranormal at that point. And they weren't even like super strong synchronicities where I would have, told people, well, yeah, you've got to believe in something more in this universe because look what happened to me. But they made me think harder. They made me do some more research, try to figure out what was going on. And then about 5 years after that, which would have been in 2015, I had this experience that really was so strong. It was still a synchronistic experience, but it was so improbably meaningful that it convinced me that not only did I need to really understand in a very methodical, rigorous way what this meant about the nature of fundamental reality, but also that I needed to talk about this publicly. So it was an event that went to that level where it convinced me so much that I was like, I'm willing to stake my reputation on talking about this because I believe it's that important for people to understand.
And what was that experience?
So that's the experience that I described in the previous interview I did with you, but I'll tell it again for those who haven't heard it. So this is something that happened, like I said, about 5 years after this romantic breakup. So I had been engaged to marry a Frenchman, actually. I was living in France at the time, and that ended badly. I came back to the United States, and I'd been back here for about 5 years. And I actually, I fell in love with an American man. I got married in the interim. But there was always this sort of like unsettledness about that breakup. And I worried a lot about how my ex was doing because we weren't in contact anymore. It was just better for both of us that we not be. And I worried about how he was doing. And I also have a very strong personal connection to France completely independently of that relationship. I had, spent many years there and really cared about that country. And I didn't have the opportunity to travel there anymore. And that was kind of, that was a difficult thing for me. So I was in a place where I had a lot of emotions and a lot of questions related to France and related to my ex. And during the period in which those emotions were really sort of at their pinnacle, I went on a weekend retreat with some friends of mine from college. We went up to the mountains of Pennsylvania. And one afternoon, we needed to find a grocery store, but we didn't know the area, so we were just kind of driving around trying to find a store. And we weren't having any luck. So my friend who was driving asked her phone to find us the nearest grocery stores. And then since she was at the wheel, she handed her phone to me. So when she handed me the phone, it had a list of like 4 or 5 grocery stores there near Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to see them on a map so that I could figure out which would be the easiest for us to get to. So I hit the map button. It took a few seconds to load. And when the map finally came up, it was showing me 4 or 5 stores, grocery stores, but grocery stores with the name Leclerc, which is a French grocery store chain. And each of them had the name of a French city after it. So it was like the Leclerc of such and such city, and the Leclerc of Carré was one of them. Carré was the only city whose name I recognized, but I wasn't, even though I knew that it was somewhere in France, I didn't know exactly where it was in France. But as I looked at this, I was just like, I told my friend, I was like, your phone thinks that we're in France, and I don't know what to do with this. And in fact, the emotional impact was just, it was immediate and very strong. Just kind of, why is this phone doing it? Why? I have been thinking about France, every day, feeling very strongly about it, and then here it is manifesting on this phone. And my friend, whose phone it was, said that she had never used her phone to look up anything in France. We hadn't been talking about any of this. It was just in my mind. And so she had no idea why her phone was doing this. And when she took the phone back, she hit a button and it started behaving completely normally. And we were able to find the grocery stores there in Johnstown and do our shopping. But then a couple of days later, when I got home, I was wondering about this again, and I was wondering where exactly in France, Carré, that city that I'd recognized, where that was. So I Googled it, and it turned out that Carré was in the region of Brittany, which is the region where I had lived with my ex. It wasn't particularly close to where I had lived with him and where he was living at that time, now, at the time that this happened, but it was in that region. And that was another huge emotional moment for me, just like, what's happening? So it was not only France, but like it was showing me Brittany, what's going on? And it was like, as soon as I knew, or as soon as I saw that that phone had been showing me Brittany, I just had this immediate intuition that if the coincidence was already that strong, that it must have been showing me specifically where my ex was on that day that it had happened. And I didn't have any regular way of finding that out. I wasn't interested in contacting him to find out. So I just Googled, his name and the date. And lo and behold, there was a page on his website, because he's also a writer and he has a blog. And there was a page on his website that listed 4 or 5 events that he was going to be going to that particular year. One of those events was on the exact date that this GPS event had happened to me. And it said that the event had happened in a little town called Kerglof. And again, I didn't know where that was, so I Googled that. And Kerglof turned out to be within 2 miles of the center of Carré. So, if my ex had indeed been at that place where he said that he was going to be on that day, and he had asked his phone to show him the nearest grocery stores, he would have seen the map that I saw when I was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania that day.
Now, you've told this story before, and I've heard you on many podcasts. I've heard you tell this story before. Like, I do podcasts a lot. I find myself repeating many stories over and over again. You said something I've never heard you say when you started this. You said that this was so powerful that you felt you had to speak publicly about it, and that you would stake your reputation on this. Like, where were you at that point? Were you in academia? Where were you as a job? Where were you what would your reputation have been at that moment?
Yeah, so at the time, I'm thinking, 2015. So I had left academia. I left in 2010, right before the breakup that I was talking about. And I left in order to be an independent writer. I just wanted to, write, not necessarily academic things, but just sort of write for a general audience. But I hadn't published any books yet, so I wasn't well known by any means. I had published maybe a few articles here and there, but I didn't have a particular audience. But I did have a feeling of, my academic training. You don't just say stuff to the world unless you're sure of it, or you have some evidence, some good reason to believe that it's true. And I hadn't published any books yet, but I knew that I was going to, and I knew that I wanted to be, known as somebody who's not a flake, but somebody who's like a serious researcher, who's very careful in the way that they convey information. And so the things that I had experienced up until that point were not at the point where I would be willing to say, yeah, the paranormal is real. I felt that it was for myself, but I didn't feel like I had the level of personal evidence where it made me willing to support this pretty outlandish claim, what mainstream society would say is outlandish. But after that incident with the GPS, and there's a little more to that, kind of the way that influenced me. In fact, like I told you in my last interview with you, it sort of set off this flurry of synchronicities, as you like to call them, this whole wave of like a month and a half of synchronicities afterward, that eventually led me to finally write an email to my ex and try to figure out like what was going on, like why was all of this happening. And I discovered that he had actually had his first child like a week, 10 days after the GPS incident. And when I found that out, it was just like, oh, that's why all this happened. That we needed to be in touch and just have like this moment of sharing that important step in his life. And it really just settled so much that I had been dealing with, and just gave me this huge sense of peace after that. So it was not only what happened with the GPS incident, but it was the way that it positively transformed my life and pushed me to do something that I didn't want to do at the time, but that was immensely beneficial to me in the long run. So I felt after that it was not only that I felt like, well, here's evidence that there's something behind the events that happened to us more than, science is currently willing to admit or can explain. But that whatever this something more is, it seems to have some kind of purpose. It seems in many cases to be beneficent. And having seen those positive impacts in my own life, I just felt like it was so important to let people know, because I think in this day and age, so many people have this idea that to be a serious person, to be a realist, to be, a smart, careful thinker, you have to deny the reality of any kind of meaning in the world. And I really felt how important it was to push back against that, because I could see that that was not the case. And I could see the negative effects that kind of almost hopelessness or despair or just that lack was having on so many people. And I want to say you don't have to accept that way of looking at the world, because sometimes these really amazing things happen. And so I wanted to explore not just my own experience, but just explore the huge range of experiences that people have that were like that, and the way that they impact their lives, which is why I called my book The Source and Significance of Coincidences, because I wanted to talk about where these events come from, and also what their significance is, what meaning they have, how they change people's lives.
Wow. Okay, this is great that we didn't cover. This is new compared to the last interview we did, which I just listened to a couple of days ago. Just as you were talking just now, you said this synchronicity allowed you to do something.
Mm-hmm.
What was that? What was that something?
Well, the first most immediate thing that it allowed me to do was, well, not even allowed me, but pushed me, like it would not let go of me until I contacted my ex. And that was not something that I wanted to do. It didn't seem like it didn't seem to me at the time that would be a good thing to do, that could just make things worse. I was completely repelled by the idea of doing that. But these synchronicities simply would not stop hounding me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, there's so many of them that happened during that 5-week period. But just to give you a taste, one of the things that happened during that time was the terrorist attacks in Paris, or the shooter, or the various points in Paris. And so, like, in the midst of, like, I'm already just surrounded by all of these coincidences related to France, and then, this is on the news for, several days. And it was just thing after thing like that. And so eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. Like, that was the only thing that because I knew that it had to do with my ex somehow. Like, there were elements of these synchronicities that let me know for sure that it had something to do with him. And finally, I just realized the only thing that I could do was just write to him and ask what was going on. And so that's what it made me do. And it turned out to be one of the best things that I've ever done.
You wrote a series of books. What books came after this event?
So all of my books, actually, because my very first book, which is an academic book called The Feeling of Value, is actually my doctoral dissertation in philosophy. And I had written that back in 2008, but I published it for the first time a year after the GPS incident in 2016. And then 3 years after that, I published my coincidence book in 2019. And then the year after that, in 2020, I actually published a memoir of my relationship with my ex. So you can see how much this event influenced not only my thinking about this, but my willingness to talk about it publicly and share with people what happened. So I published that memoir in 2020, and then in 2021, I published the book Beyond Death, which is an essay that I had written for the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest about the best evidence for the survival of human consciousness. So that was kind of the impetus for writing that book.
Wow. Okay. I'm just going to jump the memoir. I read the memoir.
Mm-hmm.
It's either in the introduction, I think, or somewhere in there, I think you say this memoir it might have been in the acknowledgments. This memoir went through a lot of changes. It was a big, big fat book for a while, and then you trimmed it down to a more streamlined book.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start that book in relationship to this synchronistic event with the GPS?
Well,
my question is, did you start it before the event?
Oh, yes. So I really started writing that memoir in 2010 when I was going through the breakup that it is sort of its central topic.
And the book came out in 2020, so there's a 10-year gestation period for that big fat book.
Yes.
Seems like it's about 300 pages.
Yes.
It's a normal-sized book now.
Yeah, it's a normal-sized book. Yeah.
I think you said it was up to 500 or 800 pages or something like that in the...
Yeah. It was long because it was originally much less focused on that relationship and that breakup. It was originally a sort of comprehensive spiritual memoir. So it had a lot of stuff about my growing up and childhood in the Baptist church and different things like that. But I eventually decided to narrow the focus and really focus on the period when I recovered a form of faith through these early synchronistic events. And then there's a little bit of stuff about my childhood, but it's just kind of thrown in there as flashbacks.
Okay, I want to talk about the memoir, and I don't know if you have many interviews about the memoir.
I've only ever done one, Mike.
Oh, well, let's talk about it. Let's get right, because what I did is I went back and I read the memoir, I think shortly after it came out.
Yeah.
And I read it on Kindle, and there's a way to highlight things.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through the Kindle. You just opened up my Kindle, and it was like, oh, there's all my highlights from, what is it, like 4 years ago now?
Nice.
And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. Look, why did I do that? Why did I highlight that? And I read through it, and I was like, oh, that's why I highlighted that. So a few things. One, I went to NYU.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And lived in the village, and so like you were talking about streets and stuff like that, and there was a couple points where like you were talking, for instance, the Strand bookstore is on 12th Street, and I lived right on 12th and 3rd, and so that was like basically my corner bookstore.
Yeah,
was the Strand, and to be a high energy wannabe artist from the suburbs of Detroit and end up in Manhattan and Greenwich Village and have that bookstore down the street was just revelatory in my existence.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And then also there was another where you talked about a French restaurant that was on the corner of 28th and 5th. And that's where I lived, on 28th and 5th. I actually looked it up on Google Maps. And you can just about see, like with a Google Map image, you can see my apartment and the restaurant in the same frame. So,
how cool.
So that struck me as a little bit... I mean, these are small coincidences, synchronicity with a lowercase s, but wow, do I pay attention to that kind of stuff. So you were talking about a neighborhood I was very intimate with,
mm-hmm.
and then this is almost the surface stuff of the book, but we can get into the deeper stuff of the book. But you talked about simplifying your life.
Yeah.
You talked about your dependency, not just a love of nature and the love of the outdoors, but basically a dependence on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I resonated very strongly with that. And now I'm going to be really cautious saying this, and I might edit this out but as I was reading this, as I was reading, I sort of thought to myself, am I the first guy to ever read this book? Because it had that kind of like Oprah quality to it, where it felt like, I'm going to be very cautious saying this, felt like a woman would be much more receptive to this book than a guy.
Yeah, I could see that.
And I may be generalizing in a unpolitically groovy way. So
Well, you're not the first guy to ever.
I knew I wasn't, but I did have that thought. Yeah. So.
But I don't think there have been that many. So, yeah.
When you within your academic circles have your peers said, "Oh, I read that book. I read your memoir."
At least one person has. Like one of my good academic friends, who's in these parapsychology circles, but I don't know if anybody else has. It's definitely the least. It's the book of mine that has sold the fewest copies, right? Even fewer than my academic philosophy book,
wow.
If you can believe that. But yeah, so it's kind of like this like little hidden book that I guess people that really like the other stuff that I've done and want to go a little bit deeper than they find it. But yeah, it's not that well known.
Wow, there's some very beautiful, poignant points in that book. I'm just going to there's one point which I was really struck by, and I won't go into it too much, but you were talking with your mother, and there were some conversations you had with your mother that were put in the book, and I thought those were so tender and so poignant and very brave of you to be so raw. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you for that, because I think that it's people's tendency to not go there, to hide those kinds of real life experiences and just keep them very private.
Yeah.
So thank you because I thought those points were very beautiful in the story.
Well, thank you for appreciating them, because, yeah, I did try to be very, very honest and candid about not just, the things that happened, but about the things that were the most meaningful and that were the most difficult or the most emotionally impactful. And some of those were difficult things to reveal.
There's a lot in your memoir that is about your personal break with academia.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of the story, in the context of your life, in the context of you sharing so much, I found that really, really remarkable, because in a very real way, I did the same thing. I was kind of being fast-tracked to be in the advertising realm in New York City, and there was money, and there was I could kind of see the ladder that I needed to climb to get to that position, and then I walked away from all of it. I moved out west, became a ski bum, and never came back.
Yep.
And I resonated very strongly with that. So what was your break with academia? Like at a deep level, I guess, at your personal level.
Yeah. Well, I will say first that it wasn't unexpected. I've always known that I was a writer at heart, since, I was old enough to physically write with a pen on a piece of paper. I've been creating books and writing things, and I knew in college that I wanted to be a writer, and I went to graduate school in philosophy because, so I found philosophy in college, really enjoyed, debating deep questions, and so decided this was a great major for me, and also it had a lot of writing in it. And then my advisor told me, you could get paid to go to graduate school in philosophy. They'll pay your way through your PhD program. They'll pay your living expenses. I was like, oh, well, that sounds like a great way to, support myself in thinking and writing for, another 5 years at least. So that's why I went to graduate school in the first place, was I just wanted to keep thinking and writing, and this seemed to be a really good way to do that. And I guess it was in my fourth year in, I actually spent a year abroad in Paris and wrote my dissertation while I was there. And it was during that time that I felt like, no, I'm not going to stay. This is not my life. This is not what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I really don't want to be in academic philosophy. And I actually got a job offer in Paris there And I turned it down because I knew that I needed to finish my PhD. Like, it would just be stupid of me to walk away from that. I only had 1 year left. The dissertation was almost done. So I knew that I needed to finish the PhD. So I went back to New York and finished that. And I figured as long as I was doing that, I might as well apply to graduate school and like see what jobs I could get. You know, I'd put in the time to get this degree, see what sorts of benefits it could bring. So I applied to jobs and I got this really great postdoc at Brandeis University where I only had to teach one class a semester for 2 years and could just do whatever kind of research I wanted. And the rest of the time I was like, well, yeah, heck, sign me up for that. But still, like, at the same time, I was just like, this is not long term what I want to do. But at the same time, you know, being in that setting, actually working as an academic at Brandeis, you know, the longer you're in a setting, the more the expectations of the people that are part of that community start to like seep into you, and you start to like feel bad if you know, make choices that go against what they think is the most valuable thing for you to do with your life. And so, you know, I started to feel conflicted, and I was like, well, you know, should I stay in academia? Like, do I just want to leave because, you know, like it's not that easy? Like, because, you know, I was publishing and I'd had, you know, one major publication, but I'm like thinking about what else I want to write, and I'm just not inspired. I'm just not enjoying it. But I'm like, well, you know, maybe this is just real life and you just have to, you know, buckle down and, you know, be an adult and just do the things that you don't want to do. And I was kind of going back and forth. And what actually decided it was finally, I just said to myself, all right, I'm not going to think about this for like the next 2 or 3 days. Just because I have just, you know, been analyzing the problem to death. And I was like, I'm just going to stop thinking about it for 2 or 3 days. Because in the past, when I had done that, often the answer would just present itself. So I decided to do that. And I think it took like 24 hours. And suddenly it just, everything crystallized in my mind. And I was just like, I'm getting out of here. I don't belong here. I want to write independently of, you know, all the academic expectations and just do what I want to do. And I also, like you were saying, I wanted to be in nature. I wanted to have a little farm. I just wanted to be around plants and animals all day long and not in some air-conditioned office. And so I decided I was leaving. I wasn't applying for any more jobs when that postdoc was up. And the day that I took my U-Haul truck to my office at Brandeis and loaded up all of my books and drove away from there was one of the best days of my life. Not because, you know, Brandeis was a bad place, because it honestly, like, if I had to be in academia, that's the place that I would want to be. Like, it was, as universities go, like, it was awesome. But that's how I knew that academia wasn't for me, because if I wasn't happy in the perfect place in academia, then I wasn't going to be happy anywhere in academia. And I have never regretted that decision. It has been 14 years now since I left academia, and I have never once wished that I had stayed. It doesn't have to be as it. You know, I was worried then that being an adult meant doing stuff that you don't want to do, which, I mean, of course it does sometimes, but that doesn't have to be your profession. You don't have to stay in a place that feels like it's draining the life force out of you. There are so many other possibilities, and I've been really lucky to get to explore some of those in the last 14 years.
In the memoir, you spoke about being raised in a Christian household, in a Christian family, and then your crisis of faith while studying philosophy. And that was in college. And so if this is too personal, I can just edit this out, but where are you now with that, as far as your faith and how you would define that?
Yeah. So I am not religious at all. Not only do I not have any particular firm religious beliefs, but I'm not a part of any particular religious community. For a long time, even after I became an atheist, I still went to church because that was my community. I loved the environment. I loved the people. I really didn't know how to have a social life without church back then. But in the 20 years since that, I've found other ways of being in the world and other ways to connect with people. And so that isn't, institutional religion is not part of my life now, but spirituality definitely is. I'm probably more spiritual than I've been at any point in my life. And I mean, if you want to know like what that means, I mean, anyway, spirituality can mean so many things, but for me, it ultimately means a deep-seated faith that there's a benevolent force in the universe that is more intelligent than I am, and more powerful than I am. And I don't have to know everything. I don't have to control everything. I don't have to be in charge. I can allow myself to be guided and helped and directed by that larger consciousness, that larger intelligence.
If I were to give a definition of my present feelings of spirituality, it would be almost word for word of what you just said there. And I was raised in a Lutheran church, but it was so benign that it almost doesn't amount to anything in my upbringing. It was like the thing we did on Sunday.
Yeah, my upbringing was not benign.
Oh, mine was very benign. Yeah, so I sensed that very strongly in there. So, so thank you for sharing that. I felt a little uncomfortable asking such a personal question, but thank you.
Well, I think that's such a major piece of my message, of the thing that I feel compelled to share with the world, is that kind of faith, that kind of hope that comes from knowing that there is something bigger than us, that we're part of something so much bigger than we even know or realize.
I could not agree more. I opened this interview talking about two books, Beyond Death and the Synchronicity book, both of which touch on something. You actually called it paranormal, and it's really interesting because I don't know if I would call synchronicity paranormal. I guess it is, and I guess the near-death studies would also fit into what the paranormal category. It's curious. When you called it paranormal, and I wrote that down. I'm like, it feels to me more normal.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's all about your, sphere of reference, right? So if you, I mean, for some of us, extraordinary events have become quite ordinary. But I tend to call them paranormal, talking to people for whom they're not necessarily that normal.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I agree. So I struggle with that because people will come to me with their owl stories and they'll say, "This is unbelievable." And I was like, well, unless you got my email inbox, like what your experience is normal in the human condition because you are not alone. Like this is a very common experience. Most often, owls in association with death. That is the one where like the parallels are the most consistent. So, okay, let me just start it this way. In your Beyond Death book, you have a whole chapter titled Synchronicity. Mm-hmm. And in your Death Studies book, I'm pretty sure that synchronicity shows up in there a lot as far as like an idea and a concept and something you tap in and go back to. I didn't go word search the word synchronicity or coincidence, but I'm certain it's in there. So how do these two studies, the death studies and the synchronicity studies, overlap?
Well, the reason that I ended up writing the essay that became Beyond Death was actually because in writing my coincidence book, I had discovered that the most common form of coincidence, or at least the one that I was encountering in the literature most commonly, the thing that I guess had most been written about up until that point, was coincidences related to death and after-death communication. So the longest chapter in my coincidence book was already about coincidences related to people who have passed on. And I had done a lot of research in writing that chapter about evidence for survival of death. Because, I mean, if we're going to say some of these coincidences are caused by deceased people, like, we have to say, well, is there any reason to think that, deceased people are still around? And I think there is very good reason for that. So it was actually my studies of coincidence that had led me into study of survival of death, and then prepared me to write that second book on Beyond Death.
And I said just when I brought up the subject of this, like that was my direct experience too. When I started writing the Owl book,
right?
Like I was like, oh, like this is all tied into death, yeah. So, or let's say the owl,
or rather the absence of death, because ultimately what we're talking about is the fact that there is no real death. There's the death of the physical body, but otherwise death isn't really a thing.
It's certainly a thing to us physically, right? I mean, yes, it's certainly a thing.
Yes.
Where
Yes.
like someone,
Right.
someone dies
Right.
and you mourn them, and then there's a source of immense fear in people's lives yes. So, but I do know exactly what you're saying. And that's the source of so much of our ancient mythologies, is like this mystical summation, or this way to frame death in mystical terms that can then be shared as a myth or as folklore or as a campfire story. So after the publication of your Beyond Death book, you read it as an audiobook with that microphone that I'm looking at the camera right now, and I helped you with that a little bit, and I did the editing for that, so I am very, very, very well versed in that. And it was very interesting because when I'm editing, like I kind of turn off one half of my mind and I'm listening for like where the pauses are, and I'm listening for like how it would flow nicely and for the listener. And so I kind of turn off the mystical side of my head and focus on the pragmatic side of things.
Right.
And I listened to big chunks of it recently, and I hadn't listened to it for a few years since I did the editing. I was like, this is really interesting. Now, is there a good story, like one good story from that you feel would
Yes. I think since we're talking about the intersection of coincidences and death, there is definitely a story that comes to mind. So this is a case that was collected in the book The Children That Time Forgot, which is a collection of cases related to children's memories of past lives. And in one of these cases, there was a family that they had several children, but one of their children they had lost as an infant, a young daughter that they had who had died, I think at like 6 or 9 months old. And some years later, maybe 5 to 7 years later, I think, they had another child. And when that child was about 2 years old, she started just, coming out with these odd memories. For instance, one day she was in the car riding with her mom past, maybe the first time was they were driving past the hospital where the mother had given birth to the daughter who had died. And the little girl made some remark about how she had been to that hospital. And mom was like, no, you've never been there. What are you talking about? And then it was another time they drove by the cemetery where the previous daughter was buried. And now the thing was that the loss of this child had been pretty traumatic for the family, so they didn't actually talk about their daughter that they had lost. They had never told this young 2-year-old about the fact that she had a deceased sister, that had been there years ago. But they're driving past the cemetery, and this little girl says to her mom, she said, "Mom, that's that place. You remember where you put me in that hole in the ground and you almost fell on top of me?" And the mom remembered how when her daughter had died, she had been so emotionally distraught that I think, she was taking maybe some tranquilizers or something to help her get through that difficult time. And they had actually caused her to have a balance issue when she was at the burial, and she did almost fall into the grave on top of the coffin, but I guess was caught at the last minute or whatever. So this girl was, saying something that was true. And then at another point, the little girl started saying like really blatant things about the objects that she had been buried with when she remembered being her sister, basically. And she said that she had been buried with, I think it was a bracelet and then a fluffy yellow ball, she said. And her mom remembered the bracelet that she'd been buried with, but she said, we didn't bury you with the fluffy yellow ball. I think like one of her siblings had been trying to put the yellow ball in there, but the mom had said no. Well, after the little girl says this, the mom goes and asks her sibling, who was alive at the time that the previous daughter died, and said, did you put that yellow ball in the coffin? And the little girl, the other, girl admitted that even though her mom had told her not to, she had taken her little yellow ball and she had put it underneath her sister's body in the coffin and like hidden it so that nobody would know it was in there. So there were all of these things that this little girl remembered. And until this point, this is very similar to a lot of memories of previous lives that children have. There are, thousands of these cases. But the reason I'm telling this particular story is that one of the other things that this little girl said one day was, "Mom, do you remember the night that I died? There was a bright star shining in the sky." And her mom apparently hadn't thought about it in years, but when she thought back to it, she remembered that the night her daughter had died, there had been this really bright star-like thing that she had seen out in the backyard out of her house. And it had seemed to be like extraordinarily bright and kind of low. And in fact, now that I'm talking to you, a UFO aficionado, I'm thinking, well, maybe this was more like a UFO. This wasn't necessarily like a star. But they both described it as a star, but the mom said it was unusually bright and low in the sky, and she'd been so struck by it at the time that she had actually mentioned it to someone else. So it wasn't just, herself. She had mentioned it. So she told her daughter, "Yes, I do remember that." And her daughter said to her, "That was my star. It was my sign to you that I was going to be coming back."
Wow.
That story it's powerful, alone, but for me, what is the most powerful about it is that it's an example of what I call a reciprocal phenomenon. So you have, this can happen not just with synchronicities, but with apparitions or dreams, all kinds of after-death phenomena, where you not only have somebody who remembers being communicated with from beyond the grave, but then you have somebody who gets reincarnated and they remember being the person who was doing the communicating. So we have cases related to other phenomena like apparitions and things, but this is the only case that I have found so far where a child with a memory of a previous life remembers having specifically used synchronistic phenomena to communicate from beyond. So specifically using something like a star to try to send a message to her mom and to tell her, to reassure her, and be like, "Yeah, I'm going to be back. Don't worry."
There is a power in stories. There is such a power in hearing a story, someone's story, and this is me talking here, where I think you can analyze it, and you have to do that. You have to go through the process of mulling it over, analyzing it. And I find that you can overanalyze some things because the story will take the beauty out of the story by overanalyzing it. Where a parable on its own can seem open-ended and mysterious. And I think there's almost more power in that than going through some analytic process where you can find the metaphors and the symbolism, and then that almost subtracts from it. So I think that there's like a really essential human experience in sharing stories, like especially like stories like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's also actually the way that I approach the experience of coincidence and synchronicity too, because I think one of the major dangers, at least for me, being the analytical person that I am, is when these things happen to me, I'm immediately analyzing it and like trying to figure out what does it mean and where did it come from and all this. And I've learned a little bit better over time that the most important thing to do in the moment of experiencing these things is not to analyze, but to be intuitively present, to try to stay in touch on a deeper level. Mm-hmm. We were just talking a minute ago about me leaving academia and realizing that the only way to ultimately make that decision was to stop thinking about it and just, let the answer percolate up. And I really think that's the most effective approach that I have found to experiencing coincidence and synchronicity is don't analyze it to death. Mm-hmm. Just sit with the experience, let it wash over you, percolate in you, and the meaning is going to rise to the surface. And if it doesn't, then that's because there's no explicit meaning that you need to get out of it. It's affecting you on some deeper level, and that's fine. Just let it stay at that deeper level and do its work there.
Yes, I agree. I think we dream every night. Some of our dreams are unremembered, but I still think they're playing a role in shaping us. So an unremembered dream is just as vital as a remembered dream.
I like that.
I'm just saying that because that's how it feels true to me. So I think an absurd or baffling or unanswerable synchronicity or unanswerable paranormal event can still percolate in you like an unremembered dream. And I also, and this is something that has helped me enormously, and I had to do this formally. I had to grit my teeth and change myself, where I was being hit by a lot of synchronicities for a number of years between about 2006 and 2013. I still get hit with a lot of synchronicities, but those were frenetic synchronicities, and it made me a frantic, frenetic person, and they kind of fed off each other, and it was really an unhealthy chapter of my life. I had to decide consciously that I would no longer be astonished by synchronicities, but I was allowing myself to be in awe. Now, being in awe is something different than being astonished, right? A sunset happens every night, and if you see a beautiful sunset, you don't have to analyze that. You can just be in awe of its presence. And then astonishment implies, adrenaline and overthinking and being freaked out. So I was in a continual state of astonishment, and it made it almost impossible to live my normal day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So that would be. So yes, so we're essentially saying the same thing. To sit with it to not overthink it, to let it. How to say this? Here, I'll just back up. Yes, so I think we're essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you were saying that your synchronicities were very frenetic. I think sometimes we can blame the events for being this way, but it's really about our reaction to them. So if I'm thinking about all the coincidences that followed my GPS incident in 2015, that also felt very frenetic. It felt very destabilizing. It was not something that was welcome in my life, but all of the angst that went along with it was not part of the coincidence. The coincidences were trying to get me out of that state, right? And by resisting moving where they were pushing me to go, that's what was creating all of this angst. So if I had just let them, in the very beginning, push me to write that email, like it could have been all over and could have not had all of the suffering of the next 5 weeks. But because I didn't want to hear what they were saying, then there was a lot of tension and difficulty during that time.
And the way I would say that is when someone is asleep, sometimes you need to shake them in order to wake them up. Yeah. And I think I say this in the first owl book. I use that line. You have to shake them to wake them up. But if they're really asleep, you send in the owls. Then you start having owl synchronicity. So that was kind of my own kind of playful way of like describing my life in a way where, like I felt like I was, so from my direct experience, I was asleep. I was in denial about these paranormal events. Oh, I'll say back up a little bit. I was not in denial about the paranormal events. I was in denial that I could somehow be connected. I was 1,000% in denial of that. Like, no way, not me. It wasn't going to involve me. But I could read a book. I could hear other people's stories. And I believed it totally. When it heard come out of my own mouth, I wasn't going there. So that was what seemed to be the block. That was the dam in the river that needed to be broken.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because that's so parallel to my own experience of my GPS event too, because that was, on a personal level, it opened the door to me finding peace in that personal relationship. But at a professional level, it opened the door to me speaking publicly about this stuff, which I had been interested in for, 5 years or something. And, in my own little corner, I'm researching it and listening to podcasts and all of this, but wasn't willing to talk about it publicly until then. So, you were in the same boat, it sounds like.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I know a lot of other people who have been in that boat and they have come to me. This is actually something really heartening. They have come to me and said like, I was really struggling with my experiences. And it was through your podcast and it was through your interviews and it was through your book, like one form or another, they'll say. And it was because of me that I now am writing my own book, or I'm comfortable telling my own story, or like the woman who says I could tell my husband about these experiences, or the person who started a blog. That this is like wow, and that what it told me, what that informed in me was that you need to take this seriously. You need to be thoughtful about this work because other people are taking it seriously. And you are having an impact on other people's lives.
Yeah.
And I'm not I'm just like some guy who has a podcast and like does an interview every once in a while. And my books don't sell very well, but wow, is my email inbox flooded. So I feel like I'm putting these tips out into the public and it's still having a huge impact.
Yeah. Well, you hugely underestimate your presence within this world, Mike. You're not just some guy. You've had an extremely, extremely big impact on the way that people think about, especially about the intersection between synchronicity and UFO experiences. The field would not be the same if you were not in it. So, you need to know that.
Oh well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I'm from Michigan. I'm by very nature like I'm a Leo, and I'm not afraid to speak my mind, but at the same time, I'm like, from Michigan, where it's like, oh, don't you dare make a fuss about yourself, So, okay, I'm going to switch the subject a little bit. You were part of the publication of a couple of books, one of which is Eyewitness to the Afterlife, My 2 Weeks in Heaven by Elizabeth Crone, and the other is We Met on the Other Side by Scarlett Heimbuch. What was your involvement in those books? Now here, I'll also say those books, there are 2 books on the near-death experience, which is right in your wheelhouse. Mm-hmm. So what was your involvement with those books?
Yeah. So the first one that came out was Scarlett Heimbuch's book. Scarlett and I have been friends for many years at this point. She actually grew up about 10 minutes away from me. We're in slightly different generations, but we grew up almost in the same place. And we finally discovered each other when her first book came out, and there was an article in the local paper about it. And I was like, oh, look, there's somebody else who does this crazy stuff that lives around me. I have to meet her. So she and I got in touch, and, we're just kindred spirits. And a few years later, she decided that she wanted to do an updated version of her original memoir about... So, by the way, her story is about how she met her husband while he was in a coma, which it looked like he was never going to come out of. He had this really acute health crisis. All of his organs were shutting down. And she was an energy healer. And even though the situation looked like it was beyond hope, she felt this intuitive push to go and work with him if his family wanted, and his family said yes, they did want her to. And while she was doing energy work on him, she actually had a shared near-death experience with him. So she was out of her body. She was in this place where suddenly she realized that they had always known each other, that they had always loved each other, and that, they were just connected in this eternal soul level. So when she came back to her body a few days later, he was amazingly starting to recover. He finally comes out of the coma, and she's kind of like, what are we going to do? I mean, I feel like I had known him forever, but I don't know, on this earth plane, what's going to happen? And when he woke up, he didn't actually remember the experience on the other side, but he said as soon as he woke up and saw her, he not only felt that he knew everything about her, but he knew that she was going to be his wife. Mm. So it's a really fascinating story. And she had written about it originally, but she had a lot of new stuff that she had figured out about her own life. And she had a childhood NDE that she hadn't included in the first book. And she was like, oh, that actually maybe is relevant to why I was able to have this experience, and I should put that in there. So she wanted to do a second edition. And I had, at that point, a lot of experience self-publishing. And so I was like, here, I'll help you do it. So I helped her format the book, and you got in on it too, because you did some lovely artwork for the cover. Mm-hmm. So it was really a group effort putting together that new edition of We Met on the Other Side. So that came out, I guess, a year ago now, maybe a little more than a year ago, in 2023. And then Elizabeth Crone, I actually met her through the Bigelow Institute. She was also one of the prize winners for the essay contest back in 2021.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So I met her at the awards banquet that they had. I had read her essay before that, and in reading it, I was just like, this is somebody that I need to meet. I read a lot of people's essays, but hers I just connected with in this very immediate way. I was like, I need to meet this person. So we met at the banquet, and we started emailing each other and Zooming, and we've become really good friends since then. And actually, just a few months before I helped her put out her new book, Eyewitness to the Afterlife, she and Scarlett and I started the Mind and Meaning Institute, which I don't know if you've seen anything about that. We've just, it's just getting started, but this is an organization that we're setting up to really try to promote scientific and also philosophical discussion and investigation of all of these big questions about life and consciousness and our place in the universe. So the first thing that the Mind and Meaning Institute did was to publish Elizabeth's book, Eyewitness to the Afterlife, which is her account not only of her near-death experience that she had after she was struck by lightning, but also her account of all of the sort of crazy things that have happened to her since, because that happened back in the 1980s, and in the 30-some years since that, there have been a lot of odd events in her life, but some of the most striking are the precognitive dreams that she has I have never met or read about anyone who has more detailed precognitive dreams than she does. In particular, she has a lot of dreams about airplane crashes. Mm-hmm. And she not only dreams the particulars about how the crashes are going to happen, but she has dreamed the exact airline, the exact flight number, the exact number of passengers. In one case, she actually found herself in her dream on the plane as it was going down, conversing with a passenger, and that passenger told her her full name, her children's names, and afterwards she was able to find them on the flight manifest because unfortunately they perished in the airplane crash. But it's really incredible the level of detail that comes to her in these dreams. But it's been a very difficult thing for her to deal with too, because obviously these are very tragic events, and she generally feels totally helpless to prevent them from happening. And she's had to wrestle a lot with why she's having these dreams and what she's supposed to do with them. So that's a big part of her book, Eyewitness to the Afterlife, too. It's not just the NDE, but it's all of the after effects of it.
Yeah, so I have the book, I have Elizabeth Crohn's book. I also have the book that she wrote with Jeffrey Kripal, which came out maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, changed in a flash. Mm-hmm.
How are those books different?
So, Eyewitness to the Afterlife is really, well, besides the fact that that she wrote it, Jeff is not an author of this, although he did write the foreword to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's focused very much on the importance of eyewitness testimony to providing evidence for survival of death. And in fact, this book, the text of it comes from her Bigelow essay for the contest. So it's very much written in a style of here are the reasons to believe that we do continue after death. And so she's presenting her experience not just as a, interesting story, but to say, this is eyewitness testimony that provides evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that our consciousness does continue after death. And the various experiences that she's had post-NDE also, for her, are evidence of the reality of what happened, because it not only... in her NDE, she was given some precognitive information about, who was going to win the next presidential election, who was going to win the Super Bowl. Those things happened. But they also the NDE seems to have changed her brain and her consciousness in a way that opened her up to all of these precognitive dreams. And so it helps to bolster this idea that, no, our consciousness is something much larger than our body, much larger than our brain. It's connected to something else, and you can get access to these other kinds of information, whether you want to or not. Those things can come in through those wider consciousness connections that often get developed after near-death experiences. So she talks about all of those things, and then she also has more detail in Eyewitness to the Afterlife about particularly that one plane crash dream that I was just mentioning, where she actually was talking to a specific passenger and got her name and all of those things. That's much more a part of this book.
You said those things can come in after a near-death experience. From my UFO research, those things can come in after a UFO contact experience too. Mm-hmm. So there are these issues. And so It's very common for someone I came home from the thing and there was had a missing time and there was a flying saucer and now I'm psychic. And
now I'm psychic. Yep.
And people are there's a term in my corner of this, the playground here, that people use, the trauma of enlightenment.
Mm.
Oftentimes, it's rough.
Yeah.
People go through these experiences and it's tumultuous, it's rough.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, that's very much the experience of people who have near-death experiences, because, I mean, to be exposed to that level of knowledge, of understanding of reality, but also that level of love, and then to have to come back here, where everything is much murkier and more difficult. That's something that Elizabeth talks about a lot, but so many other NDEers do as well. It's really hard to have that experience of something that is so much more, and then have to come back and with that memory live in this place that's so much more difficult.
And oftentimes when you come back, you basically are arriving in the hospital bed after like a trauma that was harsh enough to kill you. So so not only do you come back to this physical realm, but you come back in terrible physical pain. Yeah. So and at the same time, wow, are these when taken at in their whole, they are so heartening, these stories.
Yeah.
And I found that there's a few podcasts that just do people telling their stories. Just this thing is a podcast that someone talks for about 20 minutes, half hour, and they just tell their story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It is like I feel like I don't need to go to see a psychiatrist. I can just listen to those stories and be like reassured about.
Yeah. Or you don't need to go to church.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly.
That is church.
Yeah. So I can I can take a deep breath and like, okay, I can feel reassured about like reality itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So however, keep going.
Well, like you, I had re-listened to our interview from a few years ago, and towards the end of that interview, we were talking about your hypnotic regression experience when you regressed back to what happened the night before you started writing The Messengers, basically, the event that launched you on that whole journey. And I was talking about parallels between that and people who are regressed to the life between lives, and to experiences that people have in near-death experiences. I don't know if I said it on that podcast, but they're, definitely people have similar experiences when they're dead. And listening to that interview again, I was like, yeah, the parallels here are just so strong. And I found myself, again, trying to figure out why these experiences are so parallel in so many ways, and wondering if these are like two different ways for the mind to present what is essentially the same experience. Mm-hmm. So near-death experiencers, right, they're, or somebody who is remembering the life between lives, they're basically in this place that is not part of our ordinary world. They're in this other place with other beings, right, who know them, who are talking to them about their life, whether the one that they've just finished or the one that they're about to enter, and going through these different details. And when they have this experience, or when they remember this experience, it's a reality jolt, a reality shift, right? To suddenly be like, okay, this world that I'm living in right now, this is not the whole world. This is really just like some little piece of a much wider universe where all of these other beings exist. And that's precisely the same thing that people having UFO experiences are experiencing, right? So they're, okay, this are, everyday reality. This is not the whole thing that exists. There are all these other beings out there, these other intelligent beings that I can interact with. And maybe part of me actually remembers having interacted with them before. So I think one of my big questions for the next decade, let's say, as I'm continuing to research and explore and find out more about people's experiences in these areas, is, are these really distinct experiences? Are they the same experience? If they're different, what are the differences? Are they, and what is the significance of those differences if they do exist? What do you think about this? It's been almost 5 years since we've talked about this last.
Oh, Oh, yeah. I just wrote down. So I'll jump back to that event where I was on board the craft this is in a hypnosis session. And I'm very clear. I like to preface this, and at the end I'll say it again, but like, I cannot vouch if this really happened.
Right.
Like, to me, it feels like it did not really happen. It feels like a symbolic event. I got somehow plucked from a spot where I was sleeping out under the stars. That event, when I look back at it, sure has all the clues of a UFO contact event. And I knew right away, I knew that morning, something happened last night, and I was sleeping out under the stars, and I saw a big, what I called a round building on a hill that I said, that looks just like a flying saucer, but I thought there was a building up there. I've been back to that spot many times. There's no building on that hill. So I felt something happened. And then, as you said, like, after that event, two things happened. It wasn't just I started writing the book. Within 48 hours, less than 48 hours. It wasn't actually the day after. That would have been perfect. It actually took the day after that. Because the day after, or the first day after, I processed. I made maps. I did a blog post. I did like illustration rendering of the craft that I'd seen, or the round building, let's say, that I saw. I did GPS coordinates.
Yeah, well, I mean, you woke up in the desert that morning, so you had to.
I had to do 10-hour drive too. Yeah, so to get home. So
yeah.
From that part, it's maybe 10 or 12 hours from southern Utah to Idaho. Now, and GPS things and maps, and I was really obsessed. So, but after that, I had, the day after, like, whoosh, I had my confirmation event. It was like, it was really real. It's me. It did happen. And the way I say it, which isn't exaggerating, I said, my old life ended, my new life began. Mm-hmm. I knew it. And then that afternoon, I started writing the book, The Messengers. So now let's go back to the event, which I don't know if it's true. Some years later, I actually had 2 hypnosis sessions, and they were identical. It was like watching like a rerun of Gilligan's Island, like frame for frame. It was the exact same episode. Mm-hmm. And I was on board this craft, and somehow I'm like, look down at myself, and I'm a gray alien, and I'm like, well, what's going on? I'm like a gray alien. And then the hypnotherapist, afterwards I talked to her, and she kind of said, oh, that happens all the time. That happens everyone says that. I'm like, they do? Like, oh, yeah. I'm like, okay, I guess I'd heard stories about this, but I didn't realize it was that common. And she said, oh, yeah, it's very, very common. And so then all of a sudden, I'm in a ugly conference room with these beings. And I'm like one of these beings, and I've told you this story. I remember when I first told you this story, and it might have been during the interview, but I think I can't remember. And so I was walking with 2 beings down the hall, and the next thing I'm in this conference room, and it felt like I was on trial. And there was these beings in front of me, and there were between 8 and 12 beings right on the other side of this plastic, ugly Walmart folding table. It's like, there's no science fiction element here. And I told this story to a shaman, a working shaman. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Gray beings, like aliens. They were kind of fuzzed out. They were kind of blurry, but they sure seemed like gray aliens sitting at this table. And I told this story later to a shaman, and he said, "Oh, Mike, you kind of lost me with the aliens at the folding table." And I said, "Whoa, like, okay." And he said, "Yeah." He, like, if you had said there were 8 crows, I would have been right there with you. But the fact that you said there were 8 aliens, like, no, I'm not going there. Like, and I said, what words would you use? What? Okay, like, instead of crows, like, crows are symbolic. What would be the terms you would use? And he didn't skip a beat. He said, I would say the guides. They were your guides. Well, let's, like, okay, I'm like, that resonates perfectly with me. I got no problem with that. So yeah, so they were fuzzed out. And I will also say that the little conference room, it was like, I could see the back wall, and I could see the 2 side walls. I couldn't see out the other direction. It felt like a set, like on like Saturday Night Live. They have those cheap sets. They only have 3 walls. Like on a stage, you go see a play at a high school. There's a back wall and the 2 side walls, and it's a 3-sided set. The open side is to the audience. It's theater.
Yeah,
like it really, like it's theater. It didn't really happen. It was theater. When I told you the story, I said, I was standing there. I was in front of these things, and there were 2 beings behind me. And you kind of interrupted us. Oh, the 2 beings behind you. Oftentimes, people will talk about their guides in like angelic or heaven realm, and they go to have a meeting with like the tribunal or whatever and review your life, and there's beings that you can't quite turn around and see them. Mm-hmm. And you are just like, yeah. So I am right there that there's this overlapping symbolic quality to, let's say, the shamanic journey, to the near-death experience, to the UFO contact experience. I could probably pick a few more things out and fit them in this thing too. But I feel strongly that these are, it would be incorrect to say they are the same experience, but they seem to be an experience that emerges from the same source.
Well, one thing that I notice, certainly in near-death experiences and also in dreams and in out-of-body experiences, I guess, too, is that things can shapeshift, right? Mm-hmm. So, like in near-death experiences, sometimes, somebody will meet someone and then their form will alter, or they'll sort of reveal themselves as maybe not being quite who they showed themselves to be at first. Elizabeth Crone talks about this in her book. So when she went to heaven, she was being spoken to by a voice that sounded like her deceased grandfather. Mm-hmm. But what she came to realize through the conversation, basically what this being told her, was that he wasn't actually her grandfather, but that was the easiest way to put her at ease, right? And she came to believe that she was actually talking to God through the form of her grandfather. And so I wonder, with these experiences, whether, like you said, they're coming from the same source. There's some, essential nature of these beings that we're interacting with, but the form that they take on, the form that they show themselves to us with, or maybe the form that our perception gives them, like it's not entirely clear what aspects are being projected by the being and which are ones that we're kind of overlaying on them. It's probably some of both, but that they might be, these might all be the same kind of beings, but the shaman sees them as, crows or animal guides of various sorts. Other people see them as aliens. Other people see them as religious figures, as angels, as, white-robed spiritual guides. Like, there's so many different forms they can take on. And I know of at least one person who... Actually, no, more than one person, because one person I know personally, but some people I've read about who have experiences where they've, are interacting in this other realm and have asked to see the beings as they really are. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it is just completely different from, like, it's not like everything completely changes. And in different cases, it's different. It's almost like there isn't sort of one way that they can ultimately reveal themselves to be, but it's very clear that the initial experience is not the ultimate reality of what's happening, and that you can ask to go deeper or to see more, and it's not necessarily more comprehensible. Usually it's less and less comprehensible the more you ask to see the actual reality behind the experience.
And that shows up in the UFO contact experience. People will be on board the craft and they'll say, like, mm-hmm. Are you really like they present themselves as like one thing, and like, well, what do you really look like? And mm-hmm. oftentimes they say, we can't show you because it'll scare you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they'll turn into a being of light, or they'll turn into a giant reptile or giant praying mantis, or like it's like symbolic and weird and
right.
And I want to bring this up a little later too, but in my book, The Unseen, this fiction book, I made sure to include that aspect of it in what would be the finale. I don't want to go too much into it because it's kind of a spoiler, but wow, do I like go, I speak directly to that, where the one character is looking at the other character and the character is shape-shifting and changing, and the mm-hmm. character looks down at himself and he's shape-shifting and changing. So it's not just the person in this magical realm, which is a little unclear whether it's on board a flying saucer or if it's this Michael Newton in-between realm or if it's heaven. And so... Yeah, so the person is looking down at themselves. They're, in fact, shape-shifting, and they're just as astonished that they're shape-shifting as they were to see the person they were interacting shape-shifting. Mm-hmm. That was done, that came, I used the near-death experience to inform that, and it blurs with the UFO contact experience, and I wanted to play with that blurry middle ground.
Yeah. I was just reminded, actually, this will bring us back to my memoir, so we'll tie it all together. In my memoir, I talk about kind of this revelatory moment that I had back in 2010. So as I'm experiencing my first coincidences and I'm reading, my first books on the subject, I read this book called The White Shaman, which is about a Russian woman who ends up being trained by a Siberian shaman. And there are a lot of shamanic visions that are recounted in that book. And I remember as I was reading it at the time, thinking about the imagery that was part of these visions and thinking all of these mythical characters from Siberia were present in these visions that this woman was having. And it was like something clicked in my brain, and I was like, oh, wait, maybe the spiritual world presents itself differently depending on who's experiencing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now, I mean, you and I, like, this doesn't seem that revolutionary to us. That's just the way that it works. But at the time, for me, coming from this very physicalist, naturalistic worldview that I was surrounded by, to think, maybe there's not like one. Maybe like when you see something, that's not necessarily the way that the thing is. And maybe the spiritual world has the reality of it is not something that is conveyable by sight. I mean, that makes total sense when you really think about what spirituality is. And so if we're going to have a vision of something that in its deepest nature is actually a spiritual thing, well, there's not going to be a one-to-one correlation. There's not going to be one way for the spiritual world to appear. It's going to appear differently based on the meaning that is being conveyed.
I wrote this down earlier, and I didn't get a chance to say it, but I think my mom used to say this. I can't remember where I heard this. But it was, there are many paths, and they all lead to God. So that's a big, God has got a lot of baggage associated with that, but let's just say that they all lead to like some ultimate understanding where, so what if they're presented as gray aliens or crows or dead relatives or angels or like Elizabeth Crohn's grandfather, right? So they all are serving a theatrical, symbolic purpose, uniquely tailored to the individual who's observing it, like uniquely tailored. And I think that's at the core of the synchronicity. It feels uniquely tailored to the individual. Yeah. That's why it's oftentimes tough to even share a synchronistic story, because it's like sharing a dream. If it is your dream, it has a lot of power to you. You try to tell it to someone else, it's kind of ho-hum. So there is something about this that feels like someone much smarter, some intelligence much smarter than you or I is just urging us further down this path.
And here's the other thing that just takes it to a whole new level of weirdness, is when we realize that our deepest spiritual nature is something that can't be properly represented visually, etc. And that, these experiences that we have are like stage sets, like you said. I really like that image of the three-sided stage set. If we carry that logic out, I think we ultimately have to consider the possibility that this life right now that we're living, that feels so real to us most of the time, that this is really just a set. that this is really something, that this thing that we call reality is really a metaphor or something that was a story, a virtual reality that has been created in order for us to experience a certain thing, in order to convey something to us, in order to allow us to express something that we wouldn't be able to express otherwise. But it's not... The moral of all of this isn't, oh, well, the spiritual world is this shape-shifty world. It's not like, this world that's, you can knock on the solidity of the objects around us. But ultimately, it's this world that seems so solid to us, that is just part of the surface. And the spiritual part, the elusive, shape-shifty part, that's the reality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so we have to have a completely different standard of what reality is, and the one that science has been working on so long. I mean, it's really useful for a lot of things, but basically what we've been doing is studying the structure of the stage set, and there's so much more to study than just like how we use these 2x4s to create some fake walls so that it would look like we were here. Like, there's so much more going on. Like, why did this stage set get constructed in the beginning? Who put it here? Why did they put it here? What are we doing inside of it? Yeah.
There's and this is what people don't realize. This is what bothers me about the disclosure movement, where everyone's talking about, aircraft carriers and Tic Tacs in the sky, and, and video footage of a little polka dot, that's floating over the ocean out there, where within the UFO lore, and I say this a lot, where if you get two thoughtful people talking about UFOs, within like 3 minutes, they should be asking, what does it all mean? Why are we here? Is there a God? Like, the really, really big questions are folded into this UFO mystery, if you're willing to go there. And there's I would be hard-pressed to find this in the books I've read. I went through a period where I read a lot of books, but I remember this one person talked about being in the presence of the UFO occupants on board a craft, and they tried to convey that where we are now in this, our normal physical realm, this is like being on the flat screen of the movie. It's a two-dimensional flat experience here where we are. When I'm in their realm, when I'm in their presence, time is different, light is different. That they say that is the real rich three-dimensional world or multi-dimensional world. But where we are here is void of that. We are somehow in a lesser, more constrictive world than they are, and that parallels the near-death experience, and that parallels people who take psychedelics, and that parallels people who go through shamanic initiation, journeying. There are these modalities that all seem to be overlapping and telling a similar story. Not exactly the same, obviously. They're nuanced and they each have their own flavor, but at the core, it's the same story.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever read Carl Sagan's book, Contact?
I wrote that down here. Contact. I because of what we've been talking about. I never read the book, but I did see the movie. So,
two things occurred to me about that book/movie while we were talking. But one is, in the climactic scene of that movie, so this scientist, Ellie Arroway, has been transported in this technology that was created from blueprints that came from, outer space. So basically, they're presumed that some higher intelligence, some alien intelligence has sent these blueprints. They've created this thing, and then the scientist Ellie Arroway has traveled apparently through all these wormholes in this technology. And she arrives, she pops out in this place, and she's on this beach, this otherworldly looking beach, and her deceased father starts walking towards her across the beach, and she has this conversation with her deceased father. who reveals to her through the course of the conversation that it's not really her deceased father. It's really the alien intelligence, but they realized that this was the best way to communicate with her and put her at ease. And it's so similar to what Elizabeth Crone says about her NDE. Like, it just seems like these are parallel scenes. So that's one really interesting thing about Contact. Now, one of the other interesting things about it is that Carl Sagan was an atheist, but he wrote this incredibly spiritual book, first of all, because the book, I feel like the book has even more elements of spirituality than the movie. But one of the things that is in the book that isn't in the movie is that once they've discovered, they're conversing with this alien intelligence, right? They've traveled through these wormholes. They've learned all of this stuff. So near the end of the book, and I'm sure that some of your listeners will be correcting me because I read this book 20 years ago, so this is all from memory. But as I remember it, near the end of the book, the people from Earth are conversing with these alien intelligences about these wormholes, and the aliens say, well, we just use these wormholes. Like, this is the easiest way to get from here to there. But we didn't create them. There's this vast network over the entire universe, and we have no idea how it got here. We don't know who created this. And there's also this mystical element in that book that has something to do with, I think it has to do with the number pi. I forget, some kind of thing they're saying is encoded in that. But I remember finishing that book that was supposedly written by an atheist and thinking, this man isn't an atheist. Like, or at least the way he comes across in writing this book is that there is a much greater intelligence. But for him, the only way that he and his, scientific approach to the world, the only way he could conceptualize that and feel comfortable with it was conceptualizing it as an alien. So not necessarily this one alien race, but he's sort of like conceptualizing it as this even older alien race that had created all these wormholes, or that somehow had encoded messages in the very mathematics that are the foundation of our universe. And I find that I find it fascinating on the one hand, but also it's like, I hope that in the coming decades that scientists are going to be able to be more open about these cosmic yearnings that they have, these yearnings for meaning and connection to larger intelligences, that can become more of the conversation, because we all have that. And many of us have not just the yearning, but we have the experience of these kinds of things. We've actually had the contact. That's the name of his book. It hasn't come through SETI satellite receptions the way that Carl Sagan thought that it might. It's come directly to our minds in the way that UFO experiencers have discovered, and the way that NDEers have discovered. And I hope that we can start putting all of these things together, and instead of trying to study them as separate things, as, well, here's, science and here's spirituality, we can realize, well, no, they're very much intertwined, and let's find out what each of them has to say about the other.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the grand struggle. And I think it's that yearning is in all of us. I mean, the people that all these strict materialists that are building crafts that, rove around Mars, there's like this yearning to reach beyond, into the infinite, So that's like sending a little rover to Mars is, you don't have to take a few more steps where they're trying to find the ultimate answers, So
yeah,
and then, I'm going to just make a very short aside. I did a blog post about this years and years and years ago, where in the movie Contact, the little girl who grows up to be Jodie Foster, the Ellie Arroway character, and the father. It's shown in like her youth, so it's a different actress. It was like a little girl. She was like 8 or something like that, and she's interacting with her dad. That I think he dies there in the story.
Yeah,
but he is sitting on the bed, kind of telling her, like she has a nightmare, and he's like, "Oh, just relax, everything's fine." So he sits, and then he gets up and moves, and as he gets up and moves, the picture behind him, essentially, he is replaced. The father is replaced. There's a picture of an owl directly behind him. I wonder if the set director or the director put that in there on purpose, or it just happened totally accidental. It'd be much more fun to me if it happened totally accidental.
Right.
But the father who dies and then comes back symbolically as this contact from the beyond, that is 1,000% the totem symbolism of the owl.
Yeah.
That death in the story and coming back with a message, and it gets delivered through the symbology of the owl. And that message is that the universe is richer, grander, more mysterious, more mystical than we could ever dare to imagine.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Yeah.
This has been great. Is there anything you want to say before we end this?
No, I think I've said it. Yeah, you've given me ample opportunity to say everything that's come into my head.
Good.
So I hope it's been useful to people.
But before we go, I need to say thank you to you. You have been such a strong supporter of my book, my fiction book, The Unseen. There's a level of insecurity, or let me just say, I went through it. Other authors could probably speak to this too, but wow, did I go through a level of insecurity. I self-published that thing. I had an editor help me, put some commas in the right place, but that book was all me.
Yeah.
And to push that little button that puts it up on Amazon, oh my good grief, that was like a act of abandonment on my part, because I had no idea. The book is weird and kind of mixed up and kind of difficult to understand, and I have to say that I don't fully understand that book. I really truly don't fully understand.
But it's not difficult to understand in the sense that you're reading it and you're like, I don't get it. I don't think that's it, because it's very easy to follow. It's easy to read it, but there are obviously many deeper layers to everything that happens in the book. So in that sense, it's hard to fully understand because there's always something else to unpack. I didn't want people to get the idea that it was a difficult book to read, because it's not at all. It's a real page turner.
Yeah, I tried to make yes. So, but I want to thank you for that. And I've told this story, let me back up. We did a little video. This is going back a little over a year ago. And I want to tell a story that I think I told there, but I want to tell it here because it has everything to do with and I'm sharing this here. I know you've already heard this, but I want the listeners to hear this, and I want to get your take on it a little bit, where there's a point in the book where the main character and kind of his love interest have a shared near-death experience. It's not a death experience in that sense, but I was using all the near-death experience literature that I've consumed and kind of mishmashed that together into kind of a soup of a chapter where they sit under a swing set and this event happens, that they're vaulted into another reality. It happens involving owls, magically. That's based on a real event from a witness that I had, but it's totally went on my own track for this thing. And they go to a timeless realm. Yeah. And they go to that land where there's a couple things that show up in the near-death experience as well as the UFO experiences, where they knew everything. And as I finished this thing, and I worked late on it at night, and I was really avoiding writing this. I had a good outline of things that I wanted to make sure to include in this short chapter, where the narrator explains what happened, or attempts to explain, because he can't fully explain it because it's in this other realm and it doesn't match our realm, so it's beyond understanding in many ways. And I wrote it one night late, and I got up the next morning and I kind of was working on it. Oh, let me clean this up. Oh, this needs a comment here. Oh, I said that was redundant here. I'll clean that out a little bit. Oh, this one sentence could be in 2 sentences. So I was doing just the normal workaday editing, and then I was like, what did I do? What did I do? I completely created this story that hinges on this one event, And the event is, no one's going to buy it. No one's going to believe it. I'm asking such a huge leap for the reader to believe that two people could have a shared near-death experience. And as I'm doing that, I like literally start falling asleep at the desk. Like, oh my God, I might not. So I laid down and took a nap. Boom, I was out, out. And I woke up and it felt like I'd slept all night. Is it the next morning? But it was just an hour or so. So I go back to the desk, and before I start editing again, I say, I'm going to just check a few things. So I check email, and I check, on Facebook, this woman contacted me on Facebook, and I've never heard of her. And so I was kind of like, who is this lady? And and I don't do that normally. And I'm like, there's bots and there's people in fake identities. I'm like, okay, I'll Google her name. It was Scarlett Heinbuch, and she wrote a book on a shared near-death experience. And I was just like, I got on the phone with her. Like 5 minutes later, I was on the phone with her. I sought her out. I got her email, and I realized she knew you. And then I got on the phone with her right away. We talked, and it was like, okay. And I'll tell you, every doubt, it vanished. I never had a second thought about including that point in the book after that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, is that a synchronicity? That doesn't feel like a synchronicity. That feels like a divine lightning bolt from God, like into me.
Well, isn't that what all the strongest synchronicities are? I mean, it's just, the smaller synchronicities are just like a little bit of static electricity from God, but the big ones are the lightning bolts. But it's all the same stuff. It's just like how noticeable is it to us? How strong is the emotional impact on our lives?
Yeah. So, can you hear the roosters? I don't know if you can hear the roosters in the background. Oh my God, it drives me crazy. But
that's another wink to my memoir, because I talk about
roosters,
the sound of the rooster, like how important that was to me. Yeah,
it's a little. I'm pretty far north. Let me tell you, the sun comes up pretty early at this latitude. So, we're getting it's almost the solstice here, and so they could, if they could be a little more polite at like 4:30 in the morning, it'd be fine by me.
Right.
So, so that's I contacted Scarlett and I said, "Can I share that story?" She said, "Of course." And she read the book. She got back to me. She liked the Unseen enormously. Scarlett is a very clear speaker, and she's very sweet and emotional. Like like how she did not overthink the book. Where I think some people read it and they get kind of lost, and they get back to me and they can tell they're overthinking. She just tapped into exactly what I was trying to do there, where I wanted to make a book with likable characters.
Yeah.
And I wanted the reader to be rooting for the characters. Even the bad guys. I wanted the people to be rooting for the bad guys in the story. So.
Yeah. But I think it's a book that really, at least for me in reading it, and I've read it twice, and then I think about halfway through listening to the audiobook, but each time it's a book that takes me into the experience, into these extraordinary experiences. And like, I think it helps, if you've had that kind of experience in the past, I feel like it sort of helps you relive what it's like to have those synchronistic moments, to have those contact experiences, those revelations, all of those things. It puts you in that mind space, but in a very intuitive, emotional way. And
that was my intention entirely.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell a UFO story without ever using the word UFO. I wanted to talk about the emotions.
Yeah.
Right in the opening, there's like the very first page is a one sentence quote in italics, sitting there alone, centered in the page, and it says, "The story is fiction, yet the emotions are real." And that was kind of my mantra as I was writing it.
Yep. And that could be a mantra for our whole existence too, I think. To some extent, what we're living here it's not the deepest level of reality, so it's a fiction in some sense. This is a fiction, but the emotions are real.
And there are lessons in those emotions, and there's growth that can come with those emotions, and there's awakening that can come with those emotions. Yeah,
there is.
Great. Now that I got that out of the way, yes, we can end it now. So thank you so much. What are you working on now? Anything?
Oh, yes. So I've just finished a new academic book, actually, called Qualia and Non-Locality. So it's very much a theoretical book about how mind interacts with the physical world, and sort of presents a unified theory about how we can understand like ordinary. I know, nice Freudian slip there, right? Presents a unified theory about how we understand how our mind influences our body in a just like ordinary, what we think of as ordinary everyday situations, but also how psi works. And actually, I think that what I'm trying to do is show how these are really the same process and why they manifested differently in different situations. So it's a pretty technical book, but I'm hoping at some point, maybe in the next couple of years, to write a more popular version of it that's a little more accessible to non-philosophers. And if people are interested in those ideas, I've done a couple of presentations related to that. Probably the most relevant one is the presentation that I did at the Archives of the Impossible 2 conference in May of 2023, which is online. People can Google it. It's just like a 25-minute talk that I did there about the main ideas that are in that book. So I'm working on that.
Let me just interrupt. I'm going to interrupt here.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, hey, I got through all my questions except for one, and that's pretty good. Usually I have them more, and so let's just end it. It felt like, here's my question. This is the question I didn't get to. After all your research, do you have any kind of a unified field theory about these experiences and phenomena? I mean, what's at this is what I wrote. I mean, what's at play beyond this physical realm?
Yeah, well, it's so nice of you to ask, Mike, because I haven't been working on this theory. So yes, what a nice coincidence. So
yes,
yeah.
I actually have unified field theory, which you, when you were saying it, I don't know if you saw the expression, you said kind of a unified field theory. And this is in all capital letters in this question here. I said unified field theory in all capital letters. And I wrote that this morning just before I, clicked on the platform here to share screens.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yes, that is very cool. Great. How do people get in touch with you?
You can find me on the interwebs, SharonRawlette.com. And I'm also on Facebook and on X if you want to find me there.
Wonderful. This has been a delight. This has been just a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Until next time.
I look forward to it. This is Mike, and I am chiming in after the interview. I really hope you found this episode rewarding. Now, just so you know, I edit heavily, and this means listening to the entire conversation with headphones. I carefully clean up anything extraneous, and much of that is shortening some of my very long-winded questions and comments. They may seem long when you listen to it in the show, but wow, they're a lot longer without the editing. I do this work, this editing, with a focus on the sound quality and the details. I want this show to sound as good as possible, and I want you, the listener, to experience something of quality. This is so important to me. Now, a few points about the show you just listened to. First, there is a link in the show notes to the interview I did with Sharon from back in 2019. This is the show where we talked about her Synchronicity book. You can also find it by searching Unknown Country, The Unseen, Sharon Hewitt Rawlette. It should come right up, and it is well worth your time. It is a beautiful interview. Second, there are a few points within the conversation where Sharon mentions the life between lives, and I knew exactly what she was implying. She was referencing the work of the late Dr. Michael Newton. He wrote Journey of Souls, and that book has the subtitle Case Studies of Life Between Lives. And it was Sharon who encouraged me to read some of his books, and that's exactly what I did. I did an interview with a senior researcher at the Michael Newton Institute, and this was also on the Unseen podcast on Whitley Strieber's site. It was with Peter Smith, and he is a hypnotherapist who works with the pioneering techniques from the late Dr. Michael Newton. This show is also well worth listening to. Now, the third point. During the show, I mentioned a post from years ago on my blog, and this was about a scene from the 1997 movie Contact, based on the Carl Sagan book. Now, after finishing the editing, I went through and tried to look this up on my blog, but it wasn't there, and I pretty clearly remember writing about this, so it must have been as a comment on someone else's blog. Maybe it was on Christopher Knowles' site, which is The Secret Sun. Now, after making that mistake, I wasn't sure if I had described it to Sharon correctly, so I went ahead and rented the movie Contact, and I found that scene, and it is clearly foreshadowing the end of the movie. I said that the father has an owl just above his shoulder. It is pictured thumbtacked to the wall above the bed. But there was not a nightmare in the scene like I said in the interview. But in the lead-up to this moment with the owl, the father, played by David Morse, is having a conversation with Ellie Arroway, his daughter, who is played by Jenna Malone. They are having a conversation about if their ham radio, which the little girl was using earlier in the scene, if their ham radio could reach the stars, if they could talk to people on other planets. And then Ellie Arroway, in a rather tender moment, asks her father if she could talk to her dead mother on that radio. And the father doesn't answer. But she gives her father a drawing she had done, and it is of a beach. Now, the conversation that takes place, as the father is tucking the girl to bed, she asks, "Do you think there's people on other planets?" And the camera cuts to the father, and he is seen with an owl above his shoulder. He's leaning forward, so it's a little bit above his shoulder and a little bit above his back. So it is symbolically sitting on his shoulder. So we have the father, who we already understand in the plot will die, and he has a companion owl. And we also find out later that a symbolic representation of the father emerges in a mystical experience created by the aliens, these people from other planets. And this final scene takes place on a psychedelic beach in a sort of virtual reality setting created by the intelligence at the other end of the wormhole. Let me go a few steps further. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus is a master archer, and this resonates with Dave Bowman, using a bow, and that's the name of the astronaut in 2001: A Space Odyssey. He's the one who survives and gets taken through the wormhole. Dave Bowman goes on an odyssey through the wormhole. Now, Ellie Arroway is our hero in Contact, and she goes through the wormhole. She has Arrow in her name. I feel very strongly this was entirely intentional. Okay, I went on and on and on. I trust that you enjoyed the interview with Sharon. Peace and strength, and thank you so much. Bye now.